All right, welcome everybody around the world. Welcome to my subscribers. This is a topic that I've always had interest in since I was a little kid. I love dinosaurs, reptiles, dragons, and all of that. So, I gotta make a video about this. And I've done a lot of. I don't want to make this a long video though, right? But I want to highlight some very important points as to why dragons could have been very much real. Okay, and offer a reasonable explanation why we haven't yet found any remains of them. Okay, so and how we likely may. But in all my research, I also have an excellent book, which is like an encyclopedia of all mythical creatures or creatures of legend. A really great book. And it had like hundreds of examples of things you'd never even heard of. And I've studied a lot of different, dozens of different Native American tribes from North America, their beliefs, and a lot of them share similar creatures and such. So, and sometimes the legends are similar as well. But I'm going to combine a lot of these elements here tonight to show everybody something. So, as everybody already knows, Europe and Asia have always talked about dragons. You have the Nagas and you have dragons in Cambodia and India. And dragons are everywhere. Even in Africa, they have examples like that. In North and South America, they had examples like that. Large reptilian creatures that may or may not have been able to fly. Some of them were able to go in water or lived in water. And basically, dragons encompasses a wide range of reptilian type creatures. Like I said, some could be ocean based and be something like a mosasaur or plesiosaur or a giant sea serpent, right? Then you had others that were just giant serpents on land. So to the ancient Greeks and Romans, python, a giant dragon python was just a giant snake. So there are different types, right? And European dragons were also described as having limbs and sometimes wings. There are different ones called wyverns or wyverns, which only had one set of limbs. Okay, because technically wings are supposed to be the front set of limbs on birds, right, or flying creatures. Most flying creatures that have wings don't have also four legs. But nonetheless, in Asia, dragons are very long and slender. They usually have beards and such and horns as well. And they often have like a gem or a glowing thing in the center of their forehead. Not always, but Asian dragons typically can fly and they're long and snake like, but they have four limbs, but they don't have wings. Okay. And in India, anyways, you got different examples everywhere, right? So everybody around the world, I mean, even up in Russia, the native Russians, everybody talks about dragons. So how could it be that everybody's sitting there talking about these creatures as if they were real? Science says, oh, they found dinosaur bones, and it's, that sounds plausible. But at the end of the day, none of these people were. If you compile all the stories and legends from around the world, a lot of them were still talking about dragons just a couple hundred years ago, basically. When you compile them all, the people are talking about things that were existing around them or their recent ancestors. They're not talking about, oh, we found some bones. Okay, you can't apply that bone excuse across the board, across all the different cultures. So we have to at least consider, if you want to be scientific about it, that we do have all these witnesses to creatures that allegedly existed that fit a wide bracket. And for example, in Africa, one example of a type of dragon was in the Middle East was a little small one that was very small, maybe about a foot long or whatever, a small creature that could fly and was like a flying serpent with or without legs, right? And they will call them flying fiery serpents, right? It's in the Bible. It was in Egypt and such, right? So you have different types from all around the world, and what it shows is that, all the different categories of dragons that the different peoples around the world are describing match up with types of dinosaurs and such that we know did exist. So we do have a starting step that makes it more plausible. Okay, creatures that looked like each of these things did exist on this earth. I mean, you could say Asian dragons might look more far-fetched than most dinosaurs we know, but I think there probably were. I mean, dinosaurs came in all shapes and sizes, and they just yesterday, I think it was, or the other day, found what they're calling in the news the Chinese dragon, a 15-foot or 15-meter long creature that looks just like an Asian dragon, very long, but it was in the ocean based. Obviously, probably didn't fly, right? But it looked just like one. And especially if it had whiskers of any sort, boom, there you go. There's the Asian dragon. Okay, so in all the types of dragons that we have, except for winged European dragons, okay, all the other types of dragons that we have examples for from dinosaurs or from pterosaurs and from the flying reptiles. Okay, the only ones that don't have a match with known dinosaurs so far are the European dragon that has 4 legs and wings. But if you're going to talk about dragons that had 2 legs and wings, yeah, those are pterosaurs or the various types of flying reptiles that existed that became the birds of today, essentially, right? So the next important thing to point out is that we do have living dinosaurs today. So I'm not ignorant. I know dinosaurs are different than birds, but I'm just saying birds are living dinosaurs. I've seen an ostrich. Okay, there used to be elephant birds. There used to be what's the other big one? Anyways, elephant bird and something else that was absolutely massive, and moa, I think it was. And elephant birds will get 12 feet tall, and you're talking about nearing the size of like Allosaurus. Like Tyrannosaurus Rex was about 12 feet tall when it was stooped over. And you're talking about a bird that's standing upright and is 12 feet tall. I mean, this is pretty significant, and they existed until a couple hundred years ago. And they are the closest relatives of dinosaurs, right? And if you look at an ostrich's legs, they look like dinosaur legs. So creatures that looked like dragons did exist once on the earth, and the relatives of those said creatures still exist on this planet or died off recently, like that. Also, the dodo bird and this. We also now know that dinosaurs had feathers. Okay, so we see the avian connection. So, one thing that I want to propose is that, and yeah, some of the flying reptiles looked more lizard like or whatever, right? But what I want to suggest here is that a lot of the dragons that are spoken about in different cultures had avian qualities. Okay, they would have beaks or bird-like claws and limbs. Okay, and we have the griffin, for example. The griffin, people say, was Protoceratops. Again, people spoke about griffins as being alive. Okay, and in their best understanding, they would describe it as having like the head of a bird, the wings of a bird, and like essentially claws of a bird or of a lion, body of a lion. So whether it was quadruped with wings or it just had 2 legs with wings, whatever, it has avian qualities. If it has a beak and wings, it's an avian descendant. Okay, however many limbs it has, that's another argument. But if you look at it from that perspective, and considering how dinosaurs had feathers, if we were to go back in time and look at a lot of the later dinosaurs, a lot of them would resemble dragons. Okay, and what I think has happened is there are probably missing blocks in between those later dinosaurs and the surviving ancestors that we have. There's probably stepping stones in between that were the dragons of old, right? We may not have found those skeletons yet, but it would perfectly explain it, right? So you got where they came from, those later dinosaurs and the flying ones, and we got their recent relatives still existing today, being huge and all of that there, right? So whatever came in between is probably what were dragons to the ancient peoples. Okay, and not just on land, but in the ocean as well. Now, if there were cataclysms happening in the earth, ice ages and whatever, one place that you're really going to survive, okay, is underground or in the ocean. So, in all fairness, and this is one reason I hate the ocean, is that there are monsters in the ocean. I don't care what anybody says. There's big bad things out there that nobody knows about. I've always felt like that since I was a child, and I do not trust the ocean, especially the deeper out you go. Okay, and where I live, the ocean is super deep, anyways, right? So, in all fairness, ocean-based creatures could have survived all these cataclysms. You only need a breeding pair in order to have a surviving few, right? It's entirely possible that some of these later aquatic creatures, reptiles, whatever it is, teacher on, could have survived even all the ice ages and cataclysms. I don't know why science always argues that no, they didn't, no, they couldn't have. For all you know, they did. I mean, we have lots of ancient sharks have been here since like the dawn of time. You know what I mean? We still have sharks. So why not? If they survived everything, for heaven's sake, why is it that science always says, oh, we couldn't possibly have some ancient sea reptile or sea creature like that still existing somewhere? I mean, 95% of the ocean floor has not been mapped. right? 70% of the ocean hasn't even been explored, but yet they want to act like there's no way anything in the ocean could exist. Okay, and that uh, Asian dragon they found just the other day, 15 feet or 15 meters long, whichever case, don't matter. Looked just like Asian dragon, super long neck, reptilian looking, four skinny little legs, long snake like body, long snake like tail. They existed. They swam around in the waters. And if them or their descendants somehow survived in a little niche environment, that's entirely plausible over the millions of years and such subsequent to it. Okay? I don't see how that's so impossible. Now, the next interesting thing is that, we had megalania. They discovered megalania over, where was it, in Australia or New Zealand, Solomon Islands type region. And megalania was real. Now, megalania existed, I think it was 20 or 50,000 years ago. So recent human ancestors lived amidst megalania. Now, if you look at the native tribes over there, I love reading what native tribal people believe, right? Because I always put a degree of trust in everything that they say, because they are the ones who have passed down these tales for thousands of years, right? You take everything with a grain of salt, but they can provide insight to things long past that we don't have other records of, right? And native tribes from all those different countries talk about big reptiles that used to be in the ocean or in the land and so forth. So they talk about creatures like megalania that once existed, and lo and behold, they find megalania that that it did exist. What was megalania? Is a giant Komodo dragon that was 23 feet long. Okay, a Tyrannosaurus Rex. I can't remember offhand how big a Tyrannosaurus Rex is, but of all the big bipedal carnivorous, mean, nasty dinosaurs like Allosaurus, Tyrannosaurus Rex, Carnotaurus, and all them, they are between 25 and 40 feet long. They weren't super massive. And like Tyrannosaurus Rex, if it stood upright as far as it could go, was like 18 or 20 feet, but it typically was stooped over, probably around 12 or 15 feet at the most, right? And that's the biggest one was Tyrannosaurus Rex, right? So maybe T-Rex could have been up to 40 if I remember that correctly. But a lot of the other big, mean, nasty ones, like the apex predators, were only about 25 feet long. You're talking about megalania is about the size of a dinosaur. Okay, that's my point. Is it is basically a dinosaur. I know it's a lizard, but forget the classifications. What does it look like? A giant friggin' dinosaur. Okay, a dragon. These are all just words that people give them: dragon, lizard, dinosaur, whatever you want to call it. Komodo dragon, ironically dragon, but it's a giant dragon, and it existed 20 or 50,000 years ago. Okay, and peoples from that side of the world still have legends that remnants of them exist. That is still not impossible. Okay, so you got those nice tropical climates, all those mountainous jungle regions where nobody goes. Every time a scientist goes there, they find new species. Of course, there probably could be either megalania or remnants of megalania that may or may not be the same size. They just found that famous Will Smith anaconda, you know what I mean, 26 feet long. I thought they already documented 32-foot long anacondas, but you get my point. You go further out with the fancy scientists in the jungles that already exist, and you confirm what the natives have always said, right? So we do have examples of dinosaurs millions of years ago that looked like dragons. We have their avian ancestors still alive today, which don't look like dragons, but they are the genetic relatives of what dragons would have been, if you follow me. Okay, and we had not that long ago pretty much living real dragons. Now, these megalania probably would have had that fiery, poisonous bite like Komodos have, and you with all this bacteria and venom. So, dragons and basilisks and cockatrices and all that, they combined venomous capabilities, right? Dragons, some, not all dragons, but some dragons, typically European ones, were said to breathe fire, but most dragons around the world didn't breathe fire, right? Whether that's a metaphor or what, we don't know, right? But at the end of the day, having venom is normal for reptiles, right? So they could have a fiery bite that feels like fire, you know what I mean? That's deadly. And like how they said with the cockatrice, it would, or the basilisk, one of the two would like poison vegetation. It could just be that it could spray out a venom, right? And it would be toxic and it could poison things. And if things touch those plants or whatever, they would get poisoned by it. That's entirely possible. I don't know if they proved Dilophosaurus could spray poison, but I mean, reptiles today can spit poison. You got spitting cobra, I think Gila monster, and some others can exude or spit poison. Frogs exude poison. So it's possible that a reptilian type creature, even partly avian like a basilisk or a cockatrice, which again could just be something like Archaeopteryx, you know what I mean? And maybe it had poison or it could spit poison, and boom, there you got the basilisk or the cockatrice. It's just like Archaeopteryx, right? Just a brief example. So, anyways, there is reasonable grounds to say that some archaic remnant of dinosaurs existed, different types, and that around the world they were regarded as dragons. Okay, so one really cool legend from North American tribes is that of the Thunderbirds. Everybody's heard about the Thunderbirds. It's a very sacred topic you shouldn't talk about and all that, right? There's different opinions what the Thunderbirds were. Whether they were giant dinosaur birds, I kind of don't think, or giant eagles, which is what I kind of think, or something else, which to reserve their sacredness, I won't get into that today, but very interesting in its own. I won't get into that though. But going on the notion the Thunderbirds were giant birds, they have now proven that there were giant eagles, like about 23 or 26-foot wingspan that once existed, teratorns or something. No, I think teratorns are the bipedal ones, but they've proven there were giant birds like that. Okay, so we now know that that's true, and that lines up with the legends of the Thunderbirds, right? But one really cool legend that I read was, and again, this is probably sacred, and I probably shouldn't share it, but whatever, right? It's just too cool. They said that, their chiefs and their ancestors said that, oh, our ancestors, when they came to the land, there were giant lizards and reptiles, right? And they would, attack and eat the people, and it was impossible to live there. And the thunderbirds, the giant birds, would come down and kill off these giant reptiles. They could have been giant snakes. Some of them were giant snakes. Some were other reptiles, right, with like limbs. And they would fight them off and kill them off and eat them. Now, we know that birds do this today. Chickens fight snakes. Eagles fight snakes, right? It's typical behavior. So is it just an inflated legend where they just imagined there were big reptiles, or is it true? Very interesting to consider. This would have been a land that humans hadn't really been on. And these are the ancient peoples tens of thousands of years ago or 10,000 years ago migrating over to a new land untouched by humans. More reason for something like that to still be there. So, anyways, now that we have proof that there were giant birds like that, it kind of makes you think and makes you wonder. So, the thing with dinosaurs, and especially avian type dinosaurs, is that they would have these hollow bones, which it's a lot harder for bird like bones and hollow bones and light bones to survive epochs of time in erosion, in environmental wear and tear. And it's hard for anything to get fossilized. It's very, very hard. Very small percentage of things that existed that get fossilized because you need just the right conditions. So I think, in all fairness, science should never say that dragons could not have existed. I don't know why they always take that stance. There's no reasonable grounds to say that dragons could not have existed, and to just take that pompous, arrogant stance that they do and say that everybody around the world was just stupid. That's just ignorant. Okay, something reptilian was walking around, swimming around, and even sometimes flying around. And it was like that for thousands of years, recent history. Okay? All our ancient ancestors around the world talked about it. And science wants to say they're all a bunch of crazies? No, I don't think so. Science has to accept that very few things get fossilized. And if they are avian based, it'd be even harder for them to get fossilized. Okay? And I would also like to throw in something I've pointed out. If you have big creatures like that, it's going to be easier for them to serve as prey. So if you have a species that's dying out that happens to be big, like big reptiles, okay, they were the apex predators or apex in their time because they survived in a niche. They're not really adapted to everything else that has survived outside of that niche. So once their populations are dwindling off, and they're not really suited for the new environment and new other creatures. So once they die off or get killed by the changing environment or whatever, or from predation or disease, even when they die because they're big, like all the megafauna's died off, right? We don't really have megafauna too much left on Earth, right? So they're from a prior epoch where things were bigger. They die off. They're a big food source for all the things in the land. So all the smaller creatures that are hungry, the insects and everything will come flocking to the big body. We're not talking about little creatures. You know what I mean? We're talking about big ones. So there's few of them, and if they die off somewhere, they're going to be a big food source. So they'd be preyed upon, scavenged, and their bones would be broken down and all of that there. So that's my argument. It would be even harder to find creatures that have survived like that because they would undergo stuff like that, unless they were, it was a habit of theirs to go and be reclusive at their time of death and go hide in a cave or something like that there. Or maybe they would just go jump in the ocean or something weird. But I would say if they're just dying from natural causes, they probably would have been scavenged upon, and we don't find their evidence anymore. But, you know, considering that, like I said, the different types of dragons, giant sea serpents are perfectly reasonable to exist. We don't have to have 100-foot long sea serpents. A lot of the legends are just about sea serpents that are quite large. That's perfectly reasonable. There are sea snakes today that are 6 foot long or whatnot. Perfectly reasonable. You could have a fairly big one that stemmed from some ancient, and maybe not just ocean based, but maybe freshwater based, right? Perfectly reasonable. We got anacondas that are, forget Will Smith one, that were already recorded up to 30, 31, 32 feet. We know Titanoboa existed and it was what, 40 or 50 feet long. So giant snakes shouldn't surprise us. Okay. And I've seen videos of one called the Yaracama or something down in South America, and it's burrowing under the earth, like the swampy mud, to get to the giant lake. And you could see the land moving as this thing goes. And once it breaks out of the mud and gets into the water, it just sucks down, like all the water starts sucking down, and the land just starts collapsing away in. Trees get yoked down into this little vortex. And then seeing that made me think of all the different legends around the world of the ocean, the water dragons that people talk about would be able to create water spouts that would suck things down, right? And they would create weather or weather storms. There's a lot of connection with dragons and weather. So if you think about it, or they will cause floods. So if you had big serpents or big other types, like big oceanic reptiles or whatnot, right? But taking one example with the big serpent, it's having seen that with my own eyes on the video, I can now relate to why ancient peoples will think that these things are like gods of the waterways because they're so blinking huge. They eat and kill and intimidate everything else. When they go down and move around in the water, they create such subduction, I think it's called, that it looks like it creates whirlpools and it sucks the land and the trees down. I mean, it's ridiculous. If they were to like come up out of the water or bellow water out of their mouths, it would be causing floods. They could divert rivers like these dragons were said to be able to do. The dragons would be able to create rivers. If they're like that and they're, snaking around, they would create rivers. So it makes sense. Like all the seemingly crazy tales from the tribal peoples around the world actually have a reasonable basis if you think about it. Like crocodiles today, when they slide down into the water, they create this little channel. If you're something 20 or 40 or 50 feet long and you're doing that, you're coming from one little water inlet, the water is going to follow you as you go. And to the native person looking, they're going to be like, oh, wow, look at this giant water creature. And then it's creating rivers behind it. Perfectly reasonable and down to earth explanations, right? So, anyways, especially in a more primeval landscape where people hadn't really populated yet, they come into a landscape where these creatures have populated and they witness their natural behavior. And that's where these old legends would probably come from. Now, in terms of the dragons creating storms and weather and whatnot, I think it could just be that they come up to the surface during natural storms. Other ocean creatures do that. Oarfish come up during earthquakes and all that. So it could just be that those creatures get disturbed from their underwater habitats or whatnot during stormy conditions. Or maybe during stormy conditions, they like to catch more fish or something like that. So I think that's a natural explanation for that. And the people back then would just associate, oh, the storms are occurring because of the dragons. However, if you did have some types of flying dragons, giant flying reptiles or pterosaurs and such, you had Quetzalcoatlus, which was like a 36-foot wingspan, and its head was probably about 15 foot long. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, if it was standing on two legs, the tip of its beak would touch the ground. It could swallow a person whole. That's how big the thing was. And it would look reptilian-ish, even though I don't think it's a reptile. I'm not sure 100%. But they existed, right? And I'm not saying that they survived, but remnants of them or things related to them may have survived. And well, the other types of the flying reptiles, they came in all shapes and sizes. Some look more like little flying lizards. They could have been the flying fiery serpents of Ethiopia and the Middle East and the biblical lands. Um, The giant water serpents related to Titanoboa could have been like the Greek and Roman python dragon. um, Snakes in nature do get multiple heads at times, so even the tail of the Hydra is perfectly possible. It could have been just a snake or something like that that had a mutation with 7 heads. Perfectly reasonable again. Nothing that far fetched about it. Maybe it was the only one to ever have 7. You know what I mean? Even the depictions of Hercules fighting it show the Hydra as being about the size of Hercules. It's not like some giant monster. You know what I mean? Um, so, anyways, it's very interesting to consider that the flying dragons, if you had any type of flying creature, like say a Quetzalcoatlus, right, and it's flying through the sky, and it's got like a 30-some-foot wingspan, and it's flapping its wings, what's it going to do? It's going to create wind currents and all of that. Because if you had a bunch of these creatures flying around this and that there, it would stir up all this wind, it would make all this noise as they fly through the sky or let out their shrieks. And especially if they turn up during storm times, that would just make the people think that they create storms because they could create wind with their wings. I mean, if a Quetzalcoatlus flapped his wing, it would probably send you flying. You know what I mean? And they could probably make all sorts of ungodly shrieking noises that probably sound like thunder and lightning when they flap their wings. You know what I mean? Or shrieking would make the lightning noise, I'm saying. And like flapping their wings might sound like thunder, especially if you had a flock of them up in the sky. And it may not have been Quetzalcoatlus doing these things. It could have been other types. And there were other types of the flying reptiles that had like tails and all of that there, which looked more like a European flying dragon. So I think that's kind of where the myth between them controlling weather comes from, right? Whether aerial weather or water-based weather, there's plausible, reasonable examples that more primitive peoples would have, associated that with the dragon itself. In terms of breathing fire, I think there's some very reasonable explanations for this one here. I watched that documentary on TV. I thought it was a bunch of baloney saying they'd have to chew on platinum ore. Look, it's very, very simple. Okay, there's lots of creatures today like stink bugs, all sorts of things that can release hot vapor, chemicals, all sorts of things. There are probably lots of chemicals out there. I know they use this in magic and this and that there, like stage magic. There's chemicals that ignite when exposed to oxygen, to air. Okay, it could stay in a liquid form, but as soon as you shake it or drop it out or something or spray it, it burns. And they use that for special magic effects, right? And ancient peoples knew this stuff. I don't know what the compounds are, right? But it's a simple stuff, right? You can even have a cloth. This is one trick they used to do over in the East is they get this cloth and this glass looks like water. You can even drink it. I don't know if you could swallow it, but you can drink it and it doesn't harm you, right? But for whatever reason, like if you were to spray it out of your mouth or you soak this rag in it and then you hold the rag, all you have to do is expose it. There's different ones. One of them, you just set the wet rag down and then you go like this over it. And all it takes is a few seconds exposure to oxygen and it just starts to catch on fire. When you spray it out of your mouth, it explodes into flames. It looks like you can breathe fire. It's just a simple chemical, right? So the dragon could just have multiple stomachs or glands. One of them produces a chemical, and there could be another that produces another chemical, right? At the end of the day, all it's got to do is to spray out this chemical. And as soon as the chemical is exposed to air, it just creates flame. It's not rocket science. I don't see what's so impossible about that. I mean, I'm not a chemist. I don't know. Maybe it's impossible that a creature could produce those chemicals, but I don't see why. I think you could probably have some organic compound that does that when it's sprayed out into air. It might have to be sprayed out in conjunction with high heat. So maybe the dragon has to psych itself up and, like clench its muscles and increase its body temperature, which raises it just enough that when it sprays it out with force, that the pressure and the heat and the oxygen make it ignite, right? But I think that's entirely reasonably possible that they could have done that. It's not impossible. Okay. Another thing, even if they couldn't breathe fire, people may have thought they could breathe fire if the dragons were seen at times to be blowing like smoke or mist or vapor out of their nose. So that would be a bit more reasonable. If they had like say a high body temperature inside and they're in cold European environments, when they breathe, it would look like smoke billowing out, like your breath does on a cold day. But a lot of people talked about dragons having fiery breath of destruction. So there must have been some degree of truth to that. But I think it was just chemical based. I think that's all it was. Lizards and reptiles have all sorts of fancy chemicals and venoms, and it's entirely possible if you ask me. and the venoms and all that stuff can burn when they hit your skin. It can feel like fire and all of that. But anyways, um, so I think personally the most far-fetched dragon to exist would have been the European dragon that has 4 legs and wings. Now most European dragons are depicted as 2 legs with wings, but some of them, usually later, and it may just be poetic artful depiction, would be 4 legs with wings. So that doesn't really fit with anything from the known fossil record at all, right? So if we exclude that one as being maybe some later poetic interpretation, um, or maybe they saw one that had the 2 wings, which are the forelimbs, then it had the hind limbs, but it had some like malformed twin, you know what I mean? Like a parasitic twin. That might give the impression that some of them have 4 legs, you know what I mean? It could be something like that as well. Or some of them may have just had some other appendages or some type of um, like part of their body that looked like a limb but didn't function as a limb. That's possible. Because if you see these things flying around or perched up on mountains, they might look like they have 4 legs, but maybe they only have 2 sets of limbs and this other set of whatever else, like some type of ornamentation, right? A lot of dinosaurs had crazy ornamentation, so it's possible. So, anyways, I think that's a reasonable explanation for what dinosaurs were. Just there's different types. The flying ones descended obviously from the flying reptiles, pterosaurs, dinosaurs, whatever they're called. The land-based ones like the megalania and all that, all they have to be are just standard remnants of dinosaurs. And a lot of them, like griffins and others, were said to be bird-like, basilisk, cockatrice. That makes even more sense. And then you get the aquatic ones, and I already talked about that. So I think there's grounds for any one of them existing. I think the ocean-based ones and the ocean-based ones probably have the most grounds for existing. And that's why I will never be going down into one of those trenches or in any submersible vehicle or anything like that. Never in my life. Never, ever, ever. But for people to say that it's impossible for dragons to have once existed, I think that's a lie. I think the scientists are oversimplifying dragons in their mind as this big green European dragon, like from cartoons, with big giant bat wings, 4 legs, and can talk English and grant wishes. Like, yeah, those type of things probably didn't exist, right? But all the other types probably did because everybody spoke about it. And if we want to know where the remnants are, well, let's put it this way. These are rare creatures that were going extinct in their time. Like the elephant bird is gone now, and the dodo bird is gone now, and all the other creatures, and the megalania is gone now. If they went extinct in their time, they would have been rare. And they were always fought and killed by the heroes and the princes and this and that there. Their bones were taken and used for magic and for ceremony and for showing off. Even the humans were scavenging their remains. So if you're a species going extinct, okay, and the people view you as some mythical godlike creature or whatever, or as like a demonic enemy creature, depending on the culture and their outlook on dragons, they would take the bones. They might make magic powder out of it, like they probably did in China, right? You can imagine that they would have ground up all the dragon bones in China and sold it in medicine shops. Okay, so and like that elsewhere in other cultures, they would probably pulverize the bones and burn them to get rid of them, or chuck them in the ocean. So I think humans have probably been the reason why a lot of the remains are probably gone. But I think one day we probably will find remnants of dragons. But I don't think we should be looking for um, dragons that fit that model of fire breathing wings and 4 legs. We should be looking for all the different types of dragons that people spoke about. Okay, the ocean faring ones, the land faring ones, and the ones capable of flight. And the thing is, we're not going to find ones of those fossilized because they haven't been here long enough to be fossilized. That's the other thing science isn't taking. They always say, "Oh, we haven't found fossils of them," but they only have like 18 skeletons of T-Rex. T-Rex is like the most famous dinosaur. They only have one complete skeleton of T-Rex. And they only have like 18 in total partial skeletons. But T-Rex is the most famous dinosaur, right? If you didn't have that one complete skeleton, we wouldn't know about T-Rex like we do. If we didn't have those 18, we wouldn't know diddly squat about T-Rex. So, just a couple years ago, they found, what was it, a 60 or 80 foot long ichthyosaur on top of a mountain, like the fossil of it, on top of a mountain. They didn't know it existed until then, something that huge in that class of ichthyosaur, and then they found it. right? The biggest ichthyosaur to ever exist, and it was found on top of a mountain, right? So one day they might just find the skeleton of these prototypes for the dragons that came along after the dinosaurs, right? And to say that they didn't exist is just ridiculous, okay? And what's the other thing? And the other thing you have to consider is all the recent ones up until now didn't have enough time to fossilize. Okay, so you're not going to find fossils of them. They would have died in the wilderness and been preyed upon, scavenged upon, and humans would have found their bones and used them for various different things. And you will never find the traces of those recent ones. So, arguably, unless we get super lucky, we're going to be more likely to find the remnants of the dragons that came before the last few thousand years, right? So I'm not an archaeologist. I don't know where to look for that, but that's probably where you would find them, in my opinion, based on those reasons, right? But I suppose if you studied where on the Earth, if you went back, say, 10,000 years and knew on the Earth what was warm, what was viable, I would say look there and look down at that layer for that time period. That's probably, in my opinion, where you'd find skeletons of dinosaurs. But you're not going to be looking for ones with wings, right? You know what I mean? You'd be just looking for large reptiles. Like when they found Megalania, you know what I mean? Proof and point. So you can't say it's impossible. Anyways, take care.